So good morning, everyone, and welcome to our Saturday morning class. So today we're going to continue looking at, well, in some ways it's a continuation of last week. We're going to be continuing to look at an aspect of Praticca Samutpada, or conditioned co-production, or conditionality, as we often call it for short. And we're going to be looking at Karma and Rebirth, or subtitle for this morning's talk is Actions and Their Consequences. So we often use the term karma nowadays quite loosely, and we use it when we're talking in terms of perhaps what we think of as someone's fate or their destiny, or as something that's happened to someone as a consequence of what they did in the past, which is in a way getting karma completely the wrong way around, because karma simply means action. It doesn't mean the results of that action or the consequences of that action. And in fact, there is a different word for that entirely. The word vipaka stands for quite literally the fruits of our actions, so the consequences of our actions. So really, when in Buddhist terms we're speaking of karma, we quite simply mean actions, and that's actions of body, speech, and mind. And more specifically, actually, we're talking about actions that are ethical in their nature. So some of our actions may not carry much of an ethical content to them, others will. Just a brief example, perhaps we could use eating as an example of actions that could fall into either ethical or not ethical actions. We all have to eat. The body has to be sustained. So in a way, we could say that eating in order to maintain the body does not have ethical implications beyond the ethical side of our eating is around more what we choose to eat, or how we choose to eat, and why we're choosing to eat, rather than the actual simply the action of eating itself. So we can choose to eat in a way that involves harm to other living beings, or we can choose to eat in a way that doesn't involve harm to other living beings. We can choose to eat simply to maintain the body, or we can choose to eat to satisfy our greed, to just indulge our desire for pleasant tastes or particular things. So actions, actions can have ethical significance, but they may not always have ethical significance. So the Buddha's teaching on karma addresses, in particular, 4 related aspects to our actions. And the first one is that there is a difference between skillful and unskillful actions. Now, we may think that seems blindingly obvious, and in terms of our gross actions, we may agree with that. But I guess for all of us, there's a point where the actions become more and more subtle, and where we start to lose that sense of the distinction between whether they're skillful or unskillful. We quite often speak of the ethics of the private moment. What we do when we believe that no one else will ever know, no one else will ever be aware. It's simply our own private business, what we do, what we say, what we think. And we may think that under those conditions, we can forget about whether something's skillful or unskillful, that the distinction becomes irrelevant almost. It's just me. It's not affecting anyone else, so it doesn't matter. But of course it does matter, because nothing that we do actually has no effect on anyone else. Sooner or later, what we do filters out into the outside world, because whatever we do has an effect on our mind, and it helps to shape our mind, to color our mind, to set our attitudes, and that will eventually have an impact on the external world. What it is that we do, whatever we're doing in our private moment, may itself forever remain private, but nonetheless, its effects on our minds will filter out into the world and the people around us. So all of our actions, our actions are skillful and unskillful. There is a difference in the effect they have, and they all matter, even if it's just the way we think, or particularly actually if it's the way we think, of course, because the mind underpins everything that we do. The way we think affects the way we speak and the way we act. So there is a real difference between skillful and unskillful actions, all of them, and we need to bear that in mind. The second aspect is that every action has a consequence beyond its immediate results. And again, we may think that we do something and it just has an effect there and then, immediately in the world, and that's it, it's done, it's finished. But actually it doesn't. The consequences of our actions can carry on for a long, long time after we think it's all over and finished with. Because of course, what we do has an effect on the mind, both our mind and the minds of those around us. And those consequences carry on, and they can reverberate for a long, long time, long after the original action that was done has been forgotten. But the consequences are still rippling out from that. So it's, we need to look at our actions in a wider context than just what is the immediate result of what we're doing. Again, if we come back to the example of eating, and I know this is a fairly trivial example, but it's one that comes easily to mind. We may decide that yes, we will indulge ourselves in that nice, delicious large cream cake that we've seen in the window of the cake shop in town. And we think that, well, what are its consequences? Nothing really. It's just a piece of cake after all. I'll enjoy eating it and that's it. It's all over and done with, finished. But of course, the consequences continue because we've set up a habit, or we've reinforced a habit, and that habit will have the effect of us continuing to indulge ourselves in nice things to eat. And that will potentially affect our health, our well-being going into the future. So consequences roll on beyond the immediate results of the action. The next aspect is that we are all responsible for our actions and their consequences. So we can't escape our responsibility. We can't put the blame on anyone else. We can't turn around and say, you made me do it, because it's simply not true. We are responsible. We have the choice in what we do. Sometimes our choices may be limited, they may be constricted, but nonetheless, they're still our choices at the end of the day, and we have to take responsibility for them. If we don't, then how are we ever going to change and transform ourselves if we don't accept that we are responsible? If we're always putting the blame on someone else for what we do, rather than taking the responsibility ourselves. And that's responsibility for the effect that our actions have on others and the effect that they have on ourselves. It's true to say that we're not responsible if someone else gets angry at something we've said or done. Well, that anger is their responsibility, but the unpleasant feeling that was caused in them by what we did is our responsibility, and we need to take that responsibility. We can't just, for example, speak out about something we've seen without consideration of the effect that that's going to have on someone, and then turn around and say, well, that's their stuff, they've got to deal with it. It's our stuff as well, in that we need to take responsibility for example, for being sure that what we're saying can be received in the right way, and that our motivation for saying it is a genuinely, sincerely kind motivation. So yeah, the responsibility lies with us primarily for our actions, and we can't escape that. And fourthly, through our skillful actions, we can change ourselves. So I'll come back to that one a little bit later, actually, when we get into the second half of this morning's talk. But just hold that one for now. But we can change ourselves through our actions. So every time we make a choice to do one thing or another, and not big choices, or not only big choices, but the small everyday choices, the habitual choices, the choices that we're making all the time without even thinking about them, because they are so habitual. Every time we do that, we are performing karma, we're performing an action. And in so doing, we're shaping a new being, we're shaping what we're going to become, the being that we will be. So karma and vipaka, its fruits, its consequences, works on the principle of conditionality. It is part of conditionality. Our actions in the present set in motion a chain of causes and conditions that will shape our experience of the future. So skillful actions lead to a more pleasant experience in the future. Unskillful actions lead to an unpleasant experience. Now, it's not that the consequences, the vipaka of our actions, our karmas, are simply like for like. It's not an eye for an eye. It's not that if we steal something from someone today, then tomorrow someone else will steal something from us. It's not that simplistic, nor is it really that direct. It's not that a particular action will result in a similar action rebounding on us. That may well happen, but we can't necessarily link the two. But it's that our actions that we perform on a daily basis condition our mind in a particular way. And it's that conditioning of the mind that has the effect in the future. For example, if I were to lie to someone today, if someone were to ask me something and I were to deliberately lie about it, for whatever reason, maybe because I didn't want to get into trouble or I didn't want someone to think badly of me, so I'd cover something up and tell a lie. An unskillful action, certainly, in terms of the fourth precept there. But if I do that, then my experience is going to be one of fear and anxiety from then on. Every time I see that person, I'm going to be wondering whether they found out that I told them an untruth. I'm going to be wondering what they're now thinking of me, because they think I'm an untruthful person and therefore can't be relied upon. And that fear, that unpleasant mental experience, that anxiety, that unpleasant state of mind is, if you like, the karmic consequence of the action of telling a lie. It's not that someone else is going to lie to me in return. That may well happen, but that's not the karmic consequence of my action. It's the unpleasant mental state that I'm going to experience in the future on the basis of that unskillful action. And of course, the reverse of this situation is true. If I know that I always speak the truth and I always speak kindly to people, then I don't have that fear and anxiety. I can engage with people with a clear mind and in that sense with a happy mind. An incident comes to mind. Well, an incident's too strong a term, but a couple of months ago, I received an email from someone. And in it, this email was the suggestion that, well, I took it to be the suggestion that I'd behaved inappropriately towards another person and I was being pulled up on it. And I thought about this, and going back over my actions, I could see that there was no occasion when I had behaved in the way that was suggested in the email. And so I was completely calm and at ease about that. I could reply to it and point out that, that what was being suggested hadn't happened at all. And eventually, as it transpired, it hadn't, and the person, I think, had made a mistake, and I'd been sent that email in error. Now, if I wasn't sure that my behavior was ethically sound in that area, then I would have probably spent days with a fair degree of anxiety about just what had happened and was I now going to have to pay a price for it. But because I knew that it hadn't happened at all, my mind was not disturbed by that whole experience. So there we have an example of how the actions had consequences. The consequences are experienced in the mental states that they give birth to in the future going forward. So our actions are ethical or not, are skillful or unskillful, in accordance with the intention or the motivation behind them. It's not necessarily the action itself that is skillful or unskillful, but the intention behind it. So actions performed from a basis of greed, hatred, and delusion will be unskillful and will result in future suffering for us and for others. Actions performed on the basis of generosity, love, and wisdom will result in our future happiness. Now, of course, some actions can really only be performed on the basis of greed, hatred, and delusion, so they would naturally be unskillful actions. And I'm sure you can think of those quite easily. Now, an important aspect about our actions is that they're habit forming. So each time that we do something, it reinforces that tendency within the mind, and we're more likely to do it again. So there is, in Buddhism, we talk about the three poisons: greed, hatred, and delusion, that underpin our being. And every time that we act in a self-centered or selfish way, we're reinforcing that tendency towards greed and towards hatred. We're reinforcing it and making it more likely that under similar circumstances in the future, we will behave again from a basis of greed or from hatred. Of course, the opposite is also true again, that the more we act on the basis of love and of wisdom and of generosity, then the more that becomes a positive habit that is more likely to influence our behavior going forward. Another common misunderstanding of karma is that everything that happens to us is a result of our actions. If we suffer a misfortune, especially if it's something unexpected, then we say that it must be our karma. Or usually we say it must be their karma, because we generally use this when we're talking about other people. It's probably quite harmless when speaking in relation to ourselves. But of course, when we do start to apply it to other people, it leads us into an attitude of judging and blaming. And that's neither skillful nor helpful to ourselves or to others. So not everything that happens to us is a result of our past karma, our past actions. Those of you that were here last week will remember that we spoke of conditionality operating on 5 levels or 5 spheres. And we can see those now. And our actions are just one of those levels, volitional actions, or the karma niyama, as it's called. So the 4th of those 5 spheres of action. Now, what happens to us can be the result of any combination of all 5 of those spheres of conditionality. So we can't necessarily say that something specifically relates to our past volitional actions. It could have arisen on conditions from any one of those other spheres of conditionality or combination of them. So it's simply, simply not true when we see something happen to someone, say, oh, that must be their karma. We simply don't know. And quite a risky route to go down, because, as I say, it leads to an attitude of blaming or indifference, or, oh, well, they deserve it. So, we'll not do anything to help them. What we can say, however, is that every action that we do in the present, here and now, will have an effect on the future. That effect, when it materializes, will be mixed up with all the other levels of conditionality, but there will be an effect. Every action of body, speech, and mind will have a consequence to some degree or another, whether that's to our benefit or not, depending on how skillful or unskillful that action is. So I'm going to move on now. I think that's probably enough on karma for the moment. I'm going to move on to the second part of today's topic, which is rebirth. And I'd like to just spend a minute, perhaps just looking at some definition here. What do we mean by rebirth? The term itself, I think, can be a bit misleading. Well, I find it anyway, and I think other people may well, in that, of course, we speak of rebirth, and that automatically brings to mind, well, rebirth of what, or rebirth of who? And it kind of creates an impression of something with solidity, something with permanence that is being reborn. And of course, we know from the Buddha's teaching that there is nothing fixed and permanent in our being that can be reborn. We'll go into this a bit more, I think, next week. I'm being careful not to stray too much into next week's topics here, but do need to say something about it. So yeah, rebirth in a Buddhist sense is, well, there is no fixed being to be reborn. There is no soul to be reborn. And I personally prefer to use the term rebecoming, because I think that takes out this sense of something fixed, something solid, something permanent. Rebecoming is just a constant process of, we're always rebecoming. So maybe we could look at it in terms of rebecoming. If rebirth doesn't cause you any problems, the term, then fine, stick with it. So we can think of it in two ways. I mean, firstly, there is rebirth as taking, or rebecoming as taking place from one life to the next, kind of classical, traditional interpretation of it. That when this body dies, then there is rebirth into another body, however we define what is reborn or what rebecomes. Depending on our conditioning, depending on our perhaps previous religious beliefs or non-religious beliefs, depending on our culture, we may find this idea a difficult thing to accept. It certainly is contrary to our Christian conditioning, if we have that in our background, and our Christian culture. But yeah, we may find it difficult to accept the idea of rebirth or rebecoming. The Buddha certainly taught rebirth. He spoke of recollecting his past lives on the evening of his enlightenment. He spoke of looking back over all of his past lives. So we can't deny that it's there in the Buddha's teaching. None of the great teachers of Buddhism have questioned that rebirth exists. Down through the ages, Buddhists of all schools have accepted the idea of rebirth and practiced in accordance with that. But we don't know, is the honest answer. We don't know for a fact what happens after death. So because we don't know, we certainly shouldn't rule out rebirth. Why should we rule out rebirth and not rule out any other idea that we may have about what happens after death? So I think whatever our position on this, we should examine it honestly and clearly as clearly as we can, and ask ourselves, on what do we base our view of what happens after death? Why do we think what we think about what happens after death? And what are the implications of holding that view for our Dharma life, for leading a spiritual life? But above all, whatever our view about what happens after death is, I think we need to try to hold on to that view lightly and not be dogmatic about it, because it's certainly true to say that whatever our view is, to a greater or lesser extent, it's wrong, because we simply don't know. And it will be wrong until we reach that enlightened state of understanding, of knowledge, where we can see directly what is, and we no longer have to have a view or an opinion on it. So yeah, hold your view by all means, but hold it lightly. And that's something I have to tell myself over and over again as well. It can be very easy to become dogmatic about things like this. There is another way of approaching rebirth, which I think is very useful and very helpful. And that is to see rebirth or rebecoming, as it applies more easily to this, as taking place from moment to moment within this life. So conditionality shows us that everything is dependent upon causes and conditions, and those causes and conditions are constantly changing. Consequently, we are constantly changing because we are dependent on causes and conditions. Every aspect of our being is dependent upon causes and conditions. And therefore, every aspect of our being is in a constant state of flux. No matter how static we may think we are, we're not. We're changing all the time. Our states of mind are changing from second to second, even probably throughout the course of this little talk. Some of you have experienced changes of states of mind. Our bodies are changing more slowly, but they're still changing. Cells are dying and being replaced. The body is renewing itself, not as one solid entity, but as a continuing process throughout the body. So conditions and causes are changing within us, and we are changing. We are re-becoming moment by moment. So every moment we have the opportunity to exert some influence on those changing conditions through the karmic level of conditionality. We have agency. We can change. We can alter the way we think. We can alter our views. We can change. We can develop. We can grow. And by changing those conditions, we change what we become moment by moment as we progress into the future. By coming along to this class this morning, by taking part in meditation, listening to this talk and engaging with the discussion, you will have made subtle changes to your mind, and those changes will play out in the coming days, weeks, months, maybe years. So you are, in a very real sense, setting up the conditions for the new you that will come into being, is coming into being in every moment. And quite simply, that is it. That is karma and rebirth. It's conditionality at work in our lives. It's setting conditions through our actions, our karmas, and then experiencing through their consequences the becoming of our new selves.